Okay, thanks so much. Thanks for the kind introduction and thanks for having me. And I'm hoping everybody online can see my screen and can hear me. Yes, very good. Okay, right. Well, what I want to tell you about today is buyers that are considered honest. And the work I'm presenting is very much a team effort. I'm sort of just the hired gun, the mouthpiece here. And the people who are involved in this project, I hope I haven't omitted anybody who's listed there. At least one of them is in the audience right now. He can correct me if I get anything wrong. So a lot of the credit goes to them and also the funders for this research. Now, the departure point for most of my work is the observation that democracy is in retreat. All around the world, most parts of the world, this is one way of representing this retreat. This is a publication actually coming out of Sweden, out of the V-Dem Institute at the University of Lund. And what this plot shows is the liberal democracy index in 2011 plotted against that 10 years later, 2021. So what that means is that any point you see here that's below the diagonal represents a country that has lost aspects of its democracy over those 10 years. And you can see that there are some EU member states, Hungary and Poland, on the wrong side of this line. And you can see that even the US has experienced that decline. And this is just one way of plotting the data. Here's another way. This is from an even more recent report, same institute. This just came out a few months ago, that is showing the number of countries that are democratizing. This is a 20-year trend that has been cut in half over that time. And concerningly, the number of countries that are going the other way, that are autocratizing, has increased almost fourfold over the same time period. So that's my background. That is what I worry about. So why does that happen? Well, you can write about 300 books and articles on that question. There's no way to resolve that in one talk or even scratch the surface much. But there is a lot of agreement among experts that misinformation is somehow entangled in this democratic decline. So, for example, the World Economic Forum surveyed hundreds of experts about the risks over the next 2 to 10 years that the world is facing. And those experts nominated misinformation and disinformation as the #1 risk over the next 2 years. And this is, again, very recent data. This came out, I think, this year. And I wouldn't dismiss it out of hand. I think misinformation is a problem, in particular in the context of democracy. Right, so that's what I'm going to talk about. So where is misinformation? Where does it take place? Where is it resonating, and with whom and by whom? And I want to say this up front because it is, unfortunately, a well-established fact, but it is also very controversial. And that is that most of the misinformation that is circulating in the United States, and I apologize, but most of my talk today will deal with the US, simply because we know a lot about the US, and also it's pretty big and it's pretty important. So, and hopefully whatever I have to say will have some implications for Europe as well. Indeed, I will show you some European data, but most of my data today will be American. So this was an analysis, as I said, there's no doubt about this finding, but it is controversial, and you'll see why the moment I explain the graph to you. This is showing that basically, whichever way you look at it, all misinformation on Facebook in the United States is consumed, disseminated, or shared by highly conservative audiences. Now, these data, by the way, involve 208 million Facebook users. So we're not really talking about a sample here. We're sort of talking about the American population. And we also don't have issues of power. And this was done by people within Facebook in collaboration with academic researchers. And here is another data set that's from our team, came out 2 years ago, which looked at the trustworthiness of links to news outlets that were shared by members of the American Congress. We looked at every single tweet between 2016, 2022, looked at all the links in the tweets by all members of Congress, worked out the quality of those links based on an outlet called NewsGuard that is sort of almost a gold standard for domain quality. And what you find in confirmation of the Facebook data is that Republican Congress people share far more untrustworthy links than Democrats. And it doesn't matter how you measure that trustworthiness, it doesn't matter what index you use, it doesn't matter how you sample, it doesn't matter where you look. It is just the case that conservatives in the United States are particularly enmeshed in misinformation, however you define that. And this creates a dilemma, which is worth mentioning because it's a serious dilemma that has political implications as we speak. And because you now have to make a choice as a researcher. I can either tell you the truth, in which case some people will accuse me of bias because I'm seemingly talking about conservatives. The alternative is that I pretend there is political symmetry, but then I'm misrepresenting the data. And that's really the dilemma anybody who's working in misinformation in the United States has to face, because you either report the data or you pretend that the data don't exist by pretending there's political symmetry. I'm not going to pretend I'll report the data, but I want to flag this up front because that explains a lot of political activity in the United States as we speak, where researchers in misinformation have been targeted by conservatives, perhaps unsurprisingly, and are being attacked in the usual way, same as climate scientists before them. Right, so that's setting the stage. We have a dilemma, we have declining democracy, and we have something else that I want to focus on, which is this conundrum. Donald Trump, when he was president, according to fact checkers, made 30,000 false or misleading claims. Give or take a few, I'm happy to negotiate this up or down, but qualitatively, there's no question that the number was large. And here is what makes this a conundrum. The fact that 3/4 of his Republican voters and supporters considered Donald Trump to be honest along the way throughout his presidency. They continue to do so. And again, it doesn't matter who's polling, when the poll is done, what the details are, that number, order of magnitude, is invariant, roughly. Somewhere between, the high 60s and high 70s percentage points of Republican voters consider Donald Trump to be honest. And that's sort of weird, isn't it? Given his record of misinformation. And just to illustrate and to get out of the way some potential discussion about what I mean by misinformation, let's go back to day one of Donald Trump's presidency, where his press secretary claimed that his inauguration was witnessed by the largest audience ever. That claim was false. As you can see here, there are two photographs. On the left, we have Donald Trump, the inauguration. On the right, you have Barack Obama, same time, same camera, same location, same event. There are fewer people in this picture as they are in that. Okay, now that is what I call a fact. And I'm prepared to call it a fact and prepared to die on that hill, no matter what a postmodernist might want to tell me about how negotiable the construction of reality is. Yeah, well, it is, but there are also facts. This is one of them. So that's just one example of outright falsehoods that are very easy to disprove to the satisfaction of pretty much everyone. Not everyone, of course, but pretty much everyone. Now, what Trump is doing, together with other populists, and I'll get around to explaining populism and why it's relevant in a moment. Like other populists, Trump is using what McWright and Dunlap have called shock and chaos disinformation. McWright and Dunlap, by the way, are sociologists. And last time I was in Norrköping, Riley Dunlap was also here. So there's a connection between this slide and the room I'm in. And what shock and chaos disinformation, the attributes it has is that the lies people tell are easily disproven. They also often have no apparent specific purpose. Donald Trump was lying about things that were of no political consequence for him or relevance. He would say that he was at home in the White House on Saturday while he was actually playing golf in Florida. Why would he lie about that? It's kind of like, you know, what's in it for you? Come on, what's going on here? And the lies tend to be incoherent, can be incoherent. One example of shock and chaos disinformation is the Russian response to the downing of a Malaysian airliner quite some time ago now, where they initially said it was a Ukrainian attack. Then they said, oh, the plane was crashed by the pilot. Then they said the plane didn't exist. Then they said the plane took off with dead bodies. I mean, the number of stories that came out of Sputnik and these Russian organs was just immense. And they made no sense whatsoever. They were entirely incoherent. And whenever you challenge people who disseminate these falsehoods, then the challenge is being relabeled as fake news. Donald Trump's favorite word is fake news, but to him it's not his own lies, but the attempt by people to hold him accountable, such as the mainstream media who have, who say, well, here's the evidence. He was golfing in Florida while he said he was in the White House. That is what I mean by shock and chaos disinformation. Now, I think it's very important to understand that. It's very profound in its implications, at least if you believe historians and analysts of 20th century totalitarianism, such as Hannah Arendt, who said, if everybody always lies to you, the consequence is not that you believe the lies, but that no one believes anything anymore. And then you can do what you want with people like that. And I think, frankly, she's spot on. And it is the erosion, not of necessarily a shared belief, but the erosion of the attainability of truth at all, that I think is the biggest challenge that we're facing now. So let me take that as a premise or as a hypothesis that I want to explore in various ways. Now I'm going to walk you through a bunch of data analyses from a number of papers that addressed several questions. The first one is Donald Trump unique? This is again work from our team where we looked at political elites. I've already shown you a snapshot of the data early on. Now I'm going to go through the actual underlying method. We looked at about 1,000 members of the US Congress over that time. The reason there are that many is because some of them drop out, others get elected. So over time, you accumulate a large number. And also some of them have multiple Twitter accounts, their own and that of their staffers. So we harvested them all, looked at every single tweet, 1.6 million tweets. We extracted all the links and checked their trustworthiness using NewsGuard. I briefly mentioned this already, but just in a bit more detail. NewsGuard uses fairly conventional, fairly strict, commonly agreed criteria for journalistic quality to determine the quality of a domain. Now, they look at the quality of the domain, not individual articles. So they analyze something like nytimes.com or fakenews.com, okay? And they then establish the likely trustworthiness of that domain. Do they publish corrections? Do they separate or differentiate between advertisement and content? Do they have a way for readers to complain? Do they, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Just well-established standards sort of from journalism 101. And they come up with a point score. And here is the summary of these point scores across all members of Congress. Each dot is one politician, arrayed from left to right by ideology. Now, this is an American study where, in contrast to the rest of the world, red means right, not left. So the further to the right you go, the more conservative you are. Red means you're a member of the Republican Party. Blue means you're a member of the Democratic Party. What you can see is that ideology is separating members of Congress by party, by and large. But, there are some Republicans on the left and some Democrats on the right, because the ideology score is obtained by looking at their voting pattern over time. And it's a very nuanced differentiation between people on the left and the right. Now, the important thing is that every single dot below that horizontal line labeled none is identifying a Congress person who never shared an untrustworthy link, ever. Okay? Meaning they only shared quality news. Wow. Sort of quality. I mean, I think Fox News is above that line. We can argue whether it should be, but basically, they're the people who only share accurate domains. There are far more blue dots there than there are red dots. Accentuating the same pattern above the line, we have on the logarithmic scale, the share of untrustworthy domain in percentage points. And what you can see there is that the red blob on average is higher than the blue blob, indicating more misinformation or potential misinformation being shared by Republicans than Democrats. Now, these are political elites. And now you can ask, well, is this conservatism per se? Or, in fact, you can ask, is it the researcher's bias? Well, I don't see how it can be, given that we used well-established indicators that themselves, as far as we know, are not biased. But you can ask whether this is sort of a general phenomenon. Does it transcend the United States? And this is where I'm now turning, you see these data, it's expressed over time now, but the same idea on trustworthy domains. We're now turning to an analysis of other countries to see whether what's happening here is like an inherent attribute of one political view over another. And the answer is mainly no. What I'm showing you here is the same data, all tweets by all members of parliament. This is the German parliament. We've also done it for the UK. Yeah.
Very quick question. The red hill, is this the left party or the SPD?
The left party. Oh, because the reds on that screen look the same. They're actually different, slightly different reds. No, that is probably the left party. And the reason I know it's the left party is because the error bars are much greater. There are fewer tweets, and the SPD would have many more. So, but basically, what you can see is that, with one exception that I'll talk about in a second, all the parties here are basically at the zero line. That means they do not share untrustworthy domains. And it doesn't matter whether they're on the left, whether they're Greens, center left, center right, or right. There's one exception to this, and that's the blue line, which is the AFD, and the AFD is, depending on who you ask, at the very least, a populist right-wing party and maybe a neo-Nazi party. But, you know, there's no question that they're on the extreme right. And they differ from other parties, and they, in fact, resemble the Republicans in the United States. Same data in the UK, identical outcome. There isn't that qualitative big difference between left-wing and right-wing parliamentarians in the UK. Same way there isn't in Germany, but there is in the United States. So I don't think we're picking up something that is necessarily an attribute of conservatism, but we do find that when you get to the hard right, extreme right, that then even in Germany, you get this gap. So what can we conclude from that? Well, one of the reasons I think this is interesting is because we, as I already mentioned, there's a lot of data suggesting that conservatives, American conservatives, are more enmeshed with misinformation than their liberal counterparts. But it wasn't known why that is the case. In other words, we don't have a single satisfactory explanation for it. We still don't. I'm not claiming we do now, but we can add to the mix that what our work has shown is that Republican political elites are significant vectors of misinformation. So they're sending a signal to their base in so doing that it is okay to spread misinformation, or they're just presenting them with a precedent that they can follow, that the partisans can follow. So clearly we have to take that on board. All right, so Donald Trump isn't alone. But now back to the conundrum. How can he or other liars, perhaps, how can they be honest? Let's go back to this example from day one of Donald Trump's presidency, where the false claim was made on his behalf. Now, that's one thing, but now the next question we want to ask is, well, what do people make of that? Fortunately, we can answer that question because some quick thinking experimenters ran a study online using these two photos as stimulus in days of the election. And the only task participants had to answer was, which photo has more people in it? That's a very simple task. And here are the data. These are error rates. That is the percentage of people who choose the Trump photo as having more people in it. That's an error. That is not the correct response because it does not have more people in it. And what you find is that people who didn't vote or who voted for Clinton basically didn't make that mistake. Okay, they occasionally did, and that's probably because somebody jumped on the keyboard or the mouse fell on the ground or something. You know, these are a tiny fraction of errors. Now look at the last pair of bars. These are Trump voters, between 11 and 26%. Commit that error, that perceptual error. They say there are more people here on the left. Now, does that mean that they have a problem with their eyeballs or their perceptual system or something? Well, I would argue no, it's not a perceptual problem. Quite on the contrary, one inference you can draw from these data is that they They know exactly what's going on. And they just say, hang on, these experimenters, they've got to be liberal academics. I'm going to show them what I think about Donald Trump. So they take the wrong picture to send a signal. In this case, it was a signal sent within an experiment. The audience was, the experimenter. In other contexts, it may affect more people. We call this, some of us have called this participatory propaganda. When people knowingly themselves engage in disseminating or sharing falsehoods on behalf of a cause or a candidate. And that assumption that this is what we're observing here is compatible with one wrinkle in the data, which is that highly educated Trump voters were far more likely to make this mistake than people with less education. Trump voters who went to college or had an MBA from Harvard or whatever, they were the ones who were most likely to pick the wrong picture. When I say the wrong picture, it is the wrong picture, because if the task is to pick the one with more people in it, you don't pick the Trump photo to be right. And this makes perfect sense. If you take into account some of Donald Trump's own statements about, encouraging his followers basically disregard anything they see or hear, with the exception, of course, of his own. Putting all this together, I think now is the time to look at a conceptual analysis of truth in the context of populism. So what's populism? I mentioned before that Trump is a populist and other politicians like him. The AfD in Germany is minimalist, the populist party. What is it? Well, there's a lot of different definitions. People, argue over this. But there are also some common elements. The common elements are, number one, it's a thin ideology. That means, unlike socialism or communism or fascism, it doesn't have a content. It doesn't have specific political commitments. I don't think, people like Donald Trump or Bolsonaro in Brazil have specific political commitments that go beyond making my cronies rich. Okay, it doesn't really have a grand vision of the future. But what they do have is this inevitable conflict between, on the one hand, the virtuous people, and on the other hand, the corrupt elites. Now, that division, of course, is entirely artificial, because there really isn't that distinction. There are millions of distinctions between different sectors of society and different interest groups and different people having different opinions. You can't just take a single line and divide the population into two. But of course, it's rhetorically a very useful thing to do. Populists are very skilled at finding that dividing line. And weirdly, immigrants never tend to be part of the people, even though they're not the elite. Wonder how that fits in. It doesn't, of course, but populists don't care. They have a dividing line between the good people on one hand and everybody else who's a corrupt elite. Now, it follows from that politicians must recognize and fulfill the people's will. That was certainly the case in the United Kingdom ever since the Brexit referendum, when any opposition or critique of government policy for a long time was relabeled as subverting the people's will, because the people's will was expressed on that one day in 2016. And from then on, everything that followed for the last 8 years had to be built on that will of the people, which of course was interpreted whichever way it happened to suit the people in power. And so the point is that populism isn't just a wrinkle. I think it is a serious threat to liberal democracies because it is negating pluralism and because it is abolishing the possibility of constructive opposition. Now, a corollary of all this is that populists will invariably appeal to the common sense of the people against this funny evidence, so-called, that the lying elites are dishing up. And so there's a direct link, I think, between populism and a different conception of truth, and one that is antithetical to liberal democracy. So let me now flesh this out a bit more. This is some work that I did a few years back, but it's also paralleled by others who I will cite in a moment, that there are different ways in which one can understand honesty. And just to be clear, what I'm talking about here now is sort of a meta understanding of honesty. I'm not talking about whether somebody, person A or B, is honest. I'm talking about what do people think is honesty. And in a nutshell, I would argue that within a populist framework, honesty relies mainly on authenticity and sincerity. Somebody is honest in a populist framework if they speak their mind and how they feel in the moment. We call that belief speaking. Okay, so if I honestly tell you how I feel, I really think the earth is flat, man. I'm really serious about that. Then I'm honestly expressing my opinion. That sincerity is a signal to honesty. And that's okay. I think sincerity is important. But there's another component to honesty, and that is one that we would hope people subscribe to in at least an idealized liberal democracy. And that relies on evidence that goes beyond sincerity. That says, well, you also, to be honest, have to tell the truth. You know, you got to have some connection to reality. So if you honestly tell me that the earth is flat, yeah, well, not really, it isn't. Okay, so it brings reality into play. We call that aspect of truth or honesty fact speaking. And by the way, I'm lumping together honesty and truth for the purposes of this talk. There's, of course, a difference between truth and honesty, but for today's purposes, I can gloss over it because it makes a difference. Now, to clarify, when we talk about belief speaking and fact speaking, they're sort of end points of a funny continuum. Funny because they're not actually necessarily in opposition, but they are end points along some continuum. Now, they go together very often. In fact, both belief speaking and fact speaking are legitimate components of honesty. And indeed, in a democracy, belief speaking should feature prominently because some issues are a matter of belief, not evidence. Your view on gay marriage, abortion, is probably not really entirely evidence-based. You know, you have a belief about that, whatever your attitude is, and that's okay. But the problem is if all that's left is belief speaking, and the idea of facts and truth can be disparaged, that's when I think you have a problem. I would argue that this is pervasive now among populist extreme right politicians. Here are just some anecdotal quotes. Giuliani on national TV, he said this: "Oh, truth isn't truth." Kind of like, what? Basically, yeah, well, truth is whatever you think is true. He effectively said that, much to the amazement of the person interviewing. The other two are right-wing personalities from the UK. Same idea. Wow, whatever is a fact for you is my lie, and vice versa. So let's not even debate about all my lies because anybody can say anything. And that is deeply problematic because I'm not the only one to say that. There's some political science on this. That's deeply problematic because, of course, democracy relies on the shared body of knowledge. You have to agree on certain things before you can even disagree about them. For example, you have to agree that an election was fair and the outcome was legitimate. You can't agree on that, well, then, good luck to you. You're in deep trouble. And I would argue that these populist conceptions of truth, this idea of common sense, belief speaking, sincerity versus the elite, that is undermining that common knowledge that is so crucial. And I think the last 4 years in the United States are a vivid illustration of that risk. So, okay, that's theoretical background. Let's see if we can identify these different conceptions of honesty in political speech. So, how would one do that? This is where it gets to be a little bit geeky. Not really, but I'll keep it at a very at a surface level. But effectively, what we did was to set out to create dictionaries that identify belief speaking and fact speaking, these two different ways of talking about truth. Now, of course, when you look at public discourse or speech, people rarely talk about their subjective conceptions of truth. Of course they don't, right? Donald Trump doesn't go up and say, yeah, well, I think my conception of honesty is that so long as I'm sincere, I'm being honest. Okay, got that? I mean, that doesn't happen. But what does happen is that the choice of words differs arguably as a function of whether people are employing a notion of honesty that is closer to belief speaking or fact speaking. And so we created these candidate items. There was a whole bunch. I'm showing you a few: belief speaking on the left, fact speaking on the right. And we thought, well, anybody who talks about evidence is probably engaging in fact speaking. Anybody who's talking about feeling, maybe not so much. They're probably talking about belief speaking. So we have these dictionaries here which allow us to analyze text and to identify in text computationally whether it is more belief speaking or fact speaking. And how do we do that? Well, one limitation of just counting words in the dictionary is that some people might be expressing belief speaking, but they're managing to do it in a way that doesn't involve any of your words, right? And yet you get the sense that they are. How do you capture that? Vice versa with fact speaking. The dictionary is a great thing, but counting words isn't the answer. So what we did was to convert the dictionaries to embeddings. And I think this is where everybody who went to this morning's talk, I don't know, is that the whole room? Probably knows a hell of a lot more about that than I'm going to tell you now. But basically, for those online or who didn't go this morning, what embeddings are numeric representations of words that are obtained by looking at their co-occurrence information in language. We use something called GLOVE, which consists of 840 billion tokens of text that were obtained not by us, by other people. This is pre-existing knowledge. 840 billion tokens obtained by crawling the web. It's basically, let's just say, the English language, sort of, okay? And it turns out that in the midst of these 840 billion tokens, there are 2.2 million unique words in quotation marks, because it's not just words, there's all sorts of other stuff in there. Names, acronyms, you name it. About 2.2 million words. And what GLOVE then did, we didn't do that, it's done for us, but it's important to explain, is to just look at the co-occurrence of these words in the English language. Here's a co-occurrence matrix, Dr. Seuss. The cat sat in the hat. This is a famous, English American children's book author, Dr. Seuss, and my kids grew up with that, and it's wonderful. And it's also very easy to see in this example what a co-occurrence matrix looked like, because, the was followed by cat 3 times in this sample, but never by anything else. Okay, and cat was followed by sat twice and once with, you get the idea. So imagine having a matrix of that type that has 2.2 million rows by 2.2 million columns. And then you discover that's way too big. There's nothing we can do with it. It is too unwieldy. And then you apply some mathematical magic, which I don't have time to get into. And you condense this into a matrix that still has 2.2 million rows, namely 1 for each word, but only 300 columns that contain in a vector the meaning of the word. So what does this look like? What does a vector look like? Well, they're basically random numbers and you don't know what they mean when you look at the random numbers. But you can do arithmetic with them. Here's one example. I love this one. If you subtract from Berlin, Germany, you get a number, not one number, 300 numbers in this vector. Some complete random noise. You look at this, you wouldn't have a clue what's going on. Okay? Now, I can do the same thing by subtracting France from Paris, meaning I go to the row where there's Paris and France, take the 300 numbers, subtract them from each other. I also get a random pair. But now here's the interesting thing. Those two will be similar. Those two, they're not random. Those two random looking series of numbers will be very similar because they capture the relationship between the country and its capital. So you can then write terrific equations like Paris is Berlin minus Germany plus France. I mean, that is technically sort of true. And once you understand this, it becomes very easy to see how we can take advantage of this by taking all the embeddings for all the words in each dictionary, average them, do the same for all the words in, let's say, a tweet or any other text, average them and compute the numeric similarity between these two vectors. All of a sudden, no longer matters whether words in our dictionary occur in text. We're not concerned with that. We're concerned whether the average meaning, let me use that word, in our dictionary, how close that is to the average meaning of a tweet or text in general. Okay, that's my sort of 5-minute introduction to embeddings, which I hope doesn't offend anyone for being too simplistic or too much of a caricature, but I think it's sort of true enough. How do we know this works? Well, we did all sorts of validations. Here's one of them. We looked at nearly 1 million articles from the New York Times dating back to 19th century, I think. Computed the extent of fact-speaking and belief-speaking similarity for different sections of the paper. And we find that fact-speaking is highest in the science section and much lower in politics and opinion. Conversely, belief speaking is highest in opinion and lower in politics and science. And don't compare the columns because that's apples and oranges. But what you can compare are the rows within each column. And that is pretty much as we expect. These numbers are on a scale from 0 to 1, cosines, and the higher they are, the greater the similarity. The differences are slight, but they're highly significant. So, fine, we have something that we can apply to something. What should we apply this to? Well, we start out with our congressional corpus that I already told you about, the tweets of all members of Congress. We identify fact-speaking versus belief-speaking, not just in the tweets, but also in all the news articles. There's 160 thousands of them that were shared by the tweets, in the tweets by the politicians. And just to illustrate, I'll leave it up to you. You tell me. We have one text on the left that's an actual tweet stripped of identifying information. The other on the right. Which of these do you think is fact speaking? Which is belief speaking? Left we have Schiff doesn't have an ironclad. He surely has an active imagination and a boatload of bad intentions. And over here, work to ensure there's a fair trial, facts are gathered. Can you take a guess? Fairly simple, fairly obvious. I think fact speaking on the right, belief speaking on the left. All right, these pop out from our analysis. And if you then look at the tweets, show them to people, their validations, human judgments agree entirely with our machine analysis. And I think intuitively, this to me is a very striking contrast. So can we link this now to different outcomes? We can identify these components. I've already shown that, but what next? How does this relate to misinformation? Well, to clarify, and I've tried to be clear all along, I'm going to say it again. So far, when I talk about belief speaking and fact speaking, I'm talking about rhetoric. I'm talking about linguistic style. I'm talking about the language being used to convey ideas based on sincerity or evidence. That doesn't by itself mean it's accurate or inaccurate. That's a separate dimension. The distinction between accurate information and misinformation is potentially orthogonal, possibly orthogonal to the rhetoric. Although, of course, the theoretical background of populism and different conceptions of truth leads us to expect that there is a correlation such that belief speaking will be preferentially associated with misinformation, fact speaking with accurate information. But that's an expectation that has yet to be confirmed, and it is also statistical in nature. You know, some of the belief speaking is accurate, some of the fact speaking inaccurate. It's bleeding across. But that's our expectation. So, what do we find? Well, here's the main result. This is looking at belief speaking and fact speaking separately. On the left, belief speaking, on the right is fact speaking. And it is plotting the quality of information, again, using our NewsGuard score, as a function of the extent of belief speaking and fact speaking similarity. So let me walk you through it one column at a time. Let's focus on fact speaking first. What this is basically showing is in both panels that the more fact speaking there is, the higher the NewsGuard score of what exactly? Of the links being shared by members of Congress in their tweet. The more fact speaking there is in the tweet, the more likely that tweet is to point to accurate information. The top panel is looking at the content of tweets. The bottom panel is looking at the content, not of the tweets, but of the source being shared in the tweet. So that's scraping the link, extracting the news article, doing the analysis on that. And the color is, again, red for Republicans, blue for Democrats. So for both parties, the more fact speaking, the more accurate the information being shared. And that's true for both parties. And by the time you get way over here, the difference between Republicans and Democrats that you know from before is considerable is actually reduced. So when Republicans do a lot of fact speaking, they tend to catch up with the Democrats in terms of quality of the links they're sharing.
Clarification question.
Yeah, sure.
It looks like there's much fewer blue dots in general on this thing. Is it because Democrats tweet less?
No, that's an artifact of the plotting superimposition. And by the way, these dots are no longer individuals. These dots are now tweets or news articles. And yeah, you're right. The red kind of shines through. That's just because of, I don't know, if you print blue on red, it's less visible than red on blue or something like that. Now let's look at belief speaking. Things are very different. And now all of a sudden you get partisan differences. Especially if you look at the shared articles. The more the articles that are being shared in a tweet express belief speaking, the less likely they are to come from an accurate domain, in particular, if they have been shared by a Republican. That's also true for Democrats. That slope is also downward, but it's far less. It's much more friendly. So belief speaking in the articles is a signal for misinformation. Well, or a signal for low information quality. Remember, we're talking about domains here as news guard, not individual articles. This isn't about fact checking. This is about quality of information. But if you're down here somewhere, chances are the story is. In the tweets, you see the same pattern if you look at the text in the tweets. But it's not nearly as striking. And for the Democrats, it's almost flat. But for Republicans, it's very significant. And there's a very significant interaction. So the conclusion is that belief speaking, the rhetoric of belief speaking, consistent with our expectation based on the populist notion of truth, is a gateway to sharing of misinformation among these politicians. And it turns out that only Republicans, or mainly Republicans, avail themselves of that opportunity. Mainly, I mean, almost. There's a slope here so the only should probably be somewhere between mainly and only, whatever word fits in there. That is the first major conclusion from that analysis of congressional speech. But now, if I still have a bit of time, I'll tell you about a bit more about the consequences of this. I showed you earlier the picture of Trump and Obama's inauguration and how people responded to that. What the public response was. I identified, participatory propaganda. Now I want to do a similar thing with the tweets by politicians and see how the public's response to that. I want to look at the contagion between the different conceptions of truth or honesty that are being articulated by a politician and what the flow-on consequences are of that. So from within the same corpus of congressional tweets, we identified around 10,000 conversations between a politician and the public. Specifically, we looked at about 100,000 replies to 10,000 seeds published by 700 politicians. And we look at one reply per replier. Because this is kind of complicated, I got to make sure I explain this properly. So we have a politician. This hypothetical person is called Donald Biden, who is tweeting something spontaneously. And we call that the seed, because that is seeding a conversation. We then consider the replies by members of the public, hence they're called John Smith or John Doe, to that politician. And we only consider the first reply by a given individual, this one, who is the same John Smith. We won't consider that because we don't know who that's addressed to. That may already be addressed to a previous replier rather than the politician. But we're assuming that the first reply is pretty good. That's probably targeting the politician. And so the question is, well, let's suppose Mr. Donald Biden engages in a lot of fact speaking. What happens to the replies? Or what happens if it's belief speaking in the C? That's what we're looking at. And to interpret the data, we need to know the politics of the people involved. Now, for politicians, that's easy. They have a party that's unambiguous. Repliers, we don't know. We don't know who John Smith is, but there are quantitative ways to identify their likely ideology. We can use that score in our analysis from left to right, tentatively. So the question is, how do people respond to different conceptions of honesty? Is there this sort of contagion? Do people align in their rhetoric? Or do they do the opposite? Do people say, oh, this is elitist evidence, not with me, mate, and then they reply with belief speaking? Which is it? Contagion, alignment, or reactance and a divergence in the styles? We also want to look at the polarization in replies. One of the major concerns in American public life at the moment is affective polarization between partisans, not just the politicians, but the voters. Now, they hate each other, basically. Might that be accentuated by belief speaking? Might we depolarize the conversation by fact speaking? So we look at polarization as well. And how does replier's ideology affect responding? So those are the questions we can ask about this analysis. I'm pretty much not going to talk about ideology because I don't have time and it's complicated. What I want to do instead is talk about the main outcome, which is contagion. Now, the two panels refer to the party of the seed, the party of the politician originating the conversation. Democrats on the left, Republicans on the right. Within each panel, the further to the right, the more the seed engaged in fact-speaking rhetoric, as opposed to belief-speaking. So you have belief-speaking here, fact-speaking there, belief-speaking here and there in each panel. And on the y-axis, you've got the extent of fact-speaking or belief-speaking in the reply, averaged across repliers. And what you can see is pretty clear. Whatever the politician is doing, the replies follow suit. That's more accentuated for Democrats, slightly, but honestly, that's not the main result. The main result is there's contagion. People align their responses to the language that's being set by the politician. Yeah, there's ideology in there too, but it's not that much, and I'll skip all of that. Now, that's a nice result, but of course, it's very confounded in many ways, because people might just, anybody who feels like belief speaking will only reply to a belief speaking tweet. There might be some selection artifact in there. So what we did was to say, oh, okay, let's see if we can identify the same dyads. So Donald Biden and John Smith, do they talk to each other more than once? And if so, is the seed different on the two different occasions? It turns out that there are 3,500 such occasions where the same politician elicits replies from the same individual on different occasions where the seed might differ in fact speaking and belief speaking. So now you've eliminated the sort of self-selection process because you're talking about the same people being triggered by the same politician under two different circumstances. And when you look at that, you still find alignment. Small, but statistically highly significant. If the seed by the politician is fact-speaking, the replies are more fact-speaking than if the seed was belief-speaking. That difference is, as I said, slight, but highly significant. So there is alignment even at the level of individuals. Affective polarization, final point I want to make today. How do we measure affective polarization? Well, guess what? We have a dictionary. And we did exactly the same thing, same embedding, same averaging, same cosine, everything in parallel, but using a dictionary for polarization developed by one of our team a couple of years ago, Almog Simpson. And just to sample some non-polarizing language on the left to polarizing language on the right. These are authentic tweets by politicians that popped out of the machine with a high and low score. It's pretty obvious that this works. And the question is, how is the reply polarization affected by the seed? And the answer is there is a big effect, such that the more fact-speaking the politicians are when they see the conversation, the less polarized the replies are. The slope is steeper for Democrats than Republicans. Yeah, okay, nice additional result. But the main thing is not the partisan difference. It's the fact that the seed of the politician matters a great deal, and that the more they talk about fact speaking, the less polarized the replies are going to be. Subject to the same issues of selection and all that. So, this is a correlational result at this point, not experimentally confirmed. But as a first approximation, with all the provisos and limited warranties and the footnote, it tells us that the politician's framing of the conversation is very important. This drives what the public does. It underscores the importance of political leadership. And that doesn't surprise me at all, because even though no one ever looks at this, or not many people do, surprisingly few, in my opinion, wherever they do look, leadership turns out to be extremely important. Same with climate change, polarization, climate change. Among the American public was entirely the result of elite cues when the Republicans retreated from a bipartisan consensus. For example, and this is adding to that lineage. So let me wrap up. This was the conundrum. How can liars be honest? And the hypothesis that we advanced was, well, maybe the language of belief speaking, which arises out of a populist framework, maybe that has led to a redirection of what it means to be honest, from being accurate to being sincere. And I would suggest that our data offer some support for that, at least initial support, because we found that belief speaking is indeed a gateway for politicians of a certain caliber to share low quality information, suggesting that they know very well that if they package it well, they can share low quality information. But whenever they are talking about evidence, then they don't, because they know it doesn't work for them. That's one interpretation of these. What's next? Well, is belief speaking considered honest even when it is inaccurate? That we don't know yet from the data I've shown you. So that's why that's in orange, not in green, because we haven't confirmed that yet. But in actual fact, we have a whole bunch of experiments basically confirming that people are more willing to accept low quality information as honest in a belief speaking framework than if we put them in a fact speaking framework. But watch this space. That is for the future. And for now, I'm done. Thank you very much for your attention. And yeah, I hope there's time for questions.